Imagine a city, right? A city already struggling with crime. And then the very police unit that's supposed to be, getting guns off the street turns out to be totally corrupt.
Oh, yeah.
That was Baltimore.
It was.
And that's what we're diving into today, the story of the Gun Trace Task Force.
Yeah, the Gun Trace Task Force. It's a story that sounds like a crime novel or something, but this was actually happening, in Baltimore back in the 2000s.
Yeah, and to help us kind of, make sense of all this corruption, we have Justin Fenton. He's an investigative reporter who covered this whole thing
Oh, wow.
for years.
Yeah.
And he even wrote a book about it called We Own This City.
Okay.
So he's got like all the firsthand accounts, interviews with people who were actually involved.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so to really understand how this happened, we kind of have to go back, right? Back to Baltimore in the 2000s, the city was dealing with a ton of crime.
Yeah.
And there was so much pressure on the police to do something about it.
So that's where the Gun Trace Task Force comes in.
Right.
Initially, people saw them as a good thing.
Yeah.
An elite unit. They're going to go after these high-level gun traffickers.
Yeah, and I think, what's interesting here is that one of the guys on the task force, Daniel Hurdles, already had like a history of misconduct even before he joined. So it makes you wonder, like, if you were running the police department, would you let somebody like that onto a special unit?
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions about, like, oversight. Like, were there any warning signs? Did anybody notice?
Absolutely. It makes you think about the culture of the police back then.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you have Wayne Jenkins, the sergeant who ends up leading this whole task force.
Yeah, he was like a superstar cop.
Yeah.
Obsessed with getting these guns off the streets.
Yeah.
Like racking up crazy numbers.
Yeah.
Which, made him popular with the department.
Right, exactly.
But as we'll see, that drive to get results kind of hit a much darker side.
Yeah, and a case that really shows us is the story of Dimitri Simon.
Oh, yeah.
This one's tough.
So imagine this, right?
Yeah.
You're Dimitri Simon. You're driving home from work, and you get pulled over for, like, some small traffic violation.
Uh-huh.
Next thing you know, you're in handcuffs.
Yeah.
And the cops are saying they found a gun on you.
Oh, wow.
But here's the thing. It was a BB gun
What?
that Jenkins and his team planted on him to justify the arrest.
Wow.
And it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
Later, they say they found drugs on him, too.
No way.
Yeah, to make their story even more believable. This incident really shows how the task force would manipulate things and just make up evidence.
Yeah, it wasn't just a one-time thing either. They were doing this kind of stuff all the time. Their focus on making things happen really created an environment where corruption could thrive.
Yeah, and the lack of oversight, plus all the access to cash and drugs, it just fueled their criminal behavior.
It was a recipe for disaster.
Totally.
And on top of all that, you had this code of silence in the police department.
Oh, right.
Where, if you saw something, you didn't say anything.
You didn't rock the boat.
Exactly. Don't rock the boat. And this code of silence, it allowed the corruption to grow.
It's crazy to think that the FBI, they actually stumbled upon the task force's illegal activities totally by accident. They were looking into a drug ring, right?
Yeah.
And they found a tracking device on a suspect's car that belonged to one of the task force members.
Wow. That's wild.
Isn't that crazy?
It is.
And get this, the FBI, they even thought about recruiting Jenkins as an informant.
Really?
They had no clue that he was the ringleader of the whole thing.
Wow. Talk about being in the dark.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But the truly sad part is, what happened to the victims. This guy, Umar Burley, he spent years in prison because of evidence that Jenkins and his crew planted.
Oh, man.
He was eventually released and got a huge settlement, but, the damage was already done.
Of course.
It's just heartbreaking. Imagine being locked up for a crime you didn't commit,
Ugh.
all because of corrupt cops. It really shows the human cost of police corruption.
Absolutely.
Like lives are shattered and people lose faith in the justice system.
It's a huge problem. And even with the officers being arrested and all the reforms that came after, this scandal still hangs over Baltimore.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked.
Yeah.
And how important it is to hold law enforcement accountable.
For sure.
Now let's dig into how this whole web of corruption unraveled.
Okay.
And how what started as a drug ring investigation
Yeah.
took down a whole police unit. Remember, the FBI wasn't even focused on the Gun Trace Task Force at the beginning.
Yeah, they were after this drug trafficking operation, and as part of it, they had put a tracking device on one of the suspects' cars. legally, of course.
Yeah, totally normal procedure.
Yeah.
So how did that lead them to the gun trace task force?
Well, the FBI agents, they went to go get their tracker back, but they found something else there, another tracker.
Wait, so somebody else is already tracking this guy?
Yeah.
What are the chances?
Right. It was a total coincidence, but it's what broke the case wide open. Because that second tracker, it belonged to a detective on the gun trace task force.
Whoa.
Yeah, so that's when the FBI knew something bigger was going on. This
Right.
wasn't just some regular drug bust anymore.
It's like something out of a movie.
It really is.
They're looking for one thing and they find this whole other mess.
Exactly. And it just shows how these things can come to light in the craziest ways. And once the FBI started digging, they found years of criminal activity. I mean, we're talking robberies, drug dealing, planting evidence, you name it, this task force was doing it.
It's unbelievable. These officers, they were supposed to be the good guys.
I know. It's a complete betrayal of public trust.
And they were doing all this while the Department of Justice was already investigating the Baltimore Police Department for other stuff.
Oh, yeah. Which says a lot about how deep this corruption went. Even under all that scrutiny, these officers were still breaking the law.
So what happened? When did it all come crashing down? What happened to these rogue cops?
Well, 7 of them got arrested back in March 2017. They were hit with a whole bunch of charges. And the trial that followed, it really exposed the crazy extent of their crimes. I mean, you had witnesses and evidence that showed just how bad it was.
Like, what were they actually doing? Give me some examples.
Okay, so they were constantly stealing money and drugs from the people they arrested. They'd make up police reports, plant evidence. They'd even use their badges to threaten people and extort money from them. They were basically criminals hiding behind their uniforms.
It's sickening. They turned their backs on everything they swore to uphold.
Yeah, and the impact on the community, devastating.
So what kind of sentences did they get?
It varied, anywhere from 7 to 25 years in prison. But the consequences were much bigger than just those guys. The whole legal system was compromised. I mean, think about all the cases they worked on, all those lives affected by their lies and fake evidence.
It's mind-blowing. How many people were wrongly convicted because of these guys?
Well, the Baltimore State's Attorney's Office had to go back and look at thousands of cases these officers had touched. And they ended up throwing out over 800 cases because the evidence was tainted or the officers couldn't be trusted anymore.
800 cases? That's insane. That's 800 lives potentially ruined by these corrupt cops.
Exactly. It shows how far-reaching the damage of police corruption can be.
And we can't forget the people who were directly victimized by these officers, the people they robbed, assaulted, sold drugs to.
Right. These are the very people they were supposed to be protecting, and instead they were hurting them. It's just awful.
Now, I'm curious about the role of investigative journalism in all this. How did Justin Fenton, the guy who wrote "We Own This City," uncover all of this?
Well, he got a tip from the U.S. Attorney's Office about a big indictment involving some Baltimore cops. He went to the press conference and realized this was huge.
So he wasn't already working on this story. This was a breaking news situation.
Yeah, a total bombshell. It shook Baltimore to its core, and Fenton knew it was a big deal and dedicated himself to getting to the bottom of it.
And that's how "We Own This City" came about.
Exactly. It's years of his investigation all put together.
It's a really incredible book.
It is. And he doesn't just tell the story of what happened. He also looks at the bigger picture. All the things within the police department that allowed this corruption to happen in the first place.
So he's connecting the actions of these officers to the systemic issues within the Baltimore PD.
Right. He talks about the lack of oversight, the pressure to get results, and that code of silence that protected bad cops.
So Fenton's work gives us the context to understand how this could have happened. It shows that this wasn't just a few bad apples.
Exactly. And it makes you think about the nature of power, and how easily it can be abused, especially in law enforcement. But it also highlights how important investigative journalism is, holding those in power accountable.
For sure. So how did the people of Baltimore react to all of this? I mean, it must have been a huge betrayal.
There was a lot of anger, understandably. People felt betrayed, let down by the system that was supposed to protect them.
Yeah, I can imagine. It really undermines trust in the police.
Absolutely. This wasn't just some isolated incident. It showed that there were serious problems within the police department and its relationship with the community. But even with all the anger, there were also people calling for reform.
So there was a desire to move forward and try to fix things.
Yeah. People wanted to make sure something like this wouldn't happen again. They organized protests, demanded changes in how the police do things, and they really pushed for more accountability and transparency.
So they took their anger and turned it into something positive.
That's right. And that kind of community involvement is so important for any kind of police reform to actually work.
It can't just be top down. It's got to come from the community, too.
Exactly. So that brings us to what happened next. The efforts to reform the Baltimore Police Department. One of the biggest things was this thing called a federal consent decree. You know what that is? So basically, it's like a legally binding agreement between the Department of Justice and the local police department.
Okay, so if the DOJ sees a pattern of, like, unconstitutional policing, they can step in and make the department change things.
Exactly. And in Baltimore's case, it meant some major changes. They had to fix the problems that allowed this level of corruption to happen.
So it was a complete overhaul of the Baltimore Police Department.
Pretty much. The consent decree covered everything: use of force policies, training, how officers are supervised, accountability, community engagement, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, that sounds like a lot. Did it work? Like, has it actually made a difference?
Well, it's tough to say for sure. I mean, there have been some good signs. Complaints against officers have gone down, and they're being more transparent, collecting more data. But like Fenton says in his book, it's a long process.
So it's too soon to say it's fixed everything.
Yeah, changing the culture of a police department takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and there have been some setbacks along the way.
Oh, yeah, I remember that officer who was caught stealing money on camera.
Right. It shows that even with all the new rules and oversight, there are still some bad apples in the bunch.
It's a good reminder that reform is an ongoing thing.
Absolutely. You got to stay vigilant, keep pushing for accountability at every level, and be willing to learn from mistakes. So what about the people of Baltimore? How did they deal with all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it had to have been tough for them.
Yeah, there's a lot of pain, a lot of anger. It makes sense. They felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to be protecting them, but they also wanted to create a better future.
So they didn't give up hope.
No, not at all. They were resilient. Community groups, they organized protests, they demanded changes in how the police operate, they spoke out for the victors of police misconduct and pushed for more accountability and transparency. They wanted to make sure something good came out of all this.
That's inspiring. They took something terrible and tried to make it better.
Exactly. And that community involvement is so important. It can't just be the police department changing from within. It has to be a partnership with the community.
So what now? What's next for the Baltimore Police Department? What lessons can we learn from all of this?
Well, they're still working on implementing all the changes from the consent decree.
Yeah.
And that's going to take time. But this whole scandal, it showed how deep the problems run. And it's clear they need to make some serious changes.
Like what specifically?
They need a culture of transparency and accountability where officers are held responsible for their actions no matter what their rank is. And they have to build trust with the community.
It's about changing how they think and act, not just the rules on paper.
Exactly. It's about creating a system of policing that is fair to everyone and accountable to the people they're supposed to be serving.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. The Gun Trace Task Force, it's a crazy example of what can happen when power goes unchecked.
It is.
And the damage it does to people and communities.
Yeah.
But it also shows how important it is to keep a close eye on things.
For sure.
How powerful investigative journalism can be. And how we need to constantly work to improve law enforcement.
Absolutely.
If you want to learn more about all this and really get into the details of police corruption and reform, you should definitely check out Justin Fenton's book, We Own This City.
Yeah, it's a great read.
It's really well written and will make you think. And if you like this deep dive, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more in-depth looks at important topics. We'll keep bringing you these fascinating stories and discussions that make you think.
We will.
Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.